Have you not wondered what glory will save you from the fate of this world? The voice rang out through the narrow hallway. The world fell apart before our eyes, but some cities yet stand. People could hear the preacher's chants from their apartments. This salvation was not the doing of the gods you know. Most people were annoyed at the disruption, but listened with novel curiosity. This was a new god. It has spoken to me. Whitney Olson was making her dinner when the preacher first passed by, shouting his convictions for all to hear. She had no idea what he was talking about. Was he seriously suggesting that a city didn't collapse? Surely everyone would have heard if a city hadn't fallen apart by now. He must be crazy. She poured a can of vegetables into a pot with some broth and lit a small gas-powered camp stove. Sydney, Australia had fared fairly well when everything fell apart. There was panic in the streets, but almost no looting and burning. With no banks, money became mostly useless, so people switched to a barter system. Whitney had recently traded a container of ground cinnamon for her new camp stove at a sports supply shop. As her soup began to warm, the roar of a car's engine took her out of her own mind and into the real world. It had been weeks since she had seen a working car. She thought everyone had run out of gas by now. As she looked down to the street below, she saw that the car had been parked along the side of the road in front of her building, but was now well on its way down the street. She watched it drive off down the empty road until it turned a corner, making the world quiet again. She didn't realize how much she had grown accustomed to the lack of noise. Before the collapse, everything had been loud. She lived in an apartment in the middle of a large city. There were always cars and trucks and construction and the everyday cacophony of people's lives. Now, all was quiet. A new feeling of longing for the past swelled within her as she turned back to her cooking. She was handling the changes fairly well, all things considered. When the restaurants closed, she learned to cook for herself. When she ran low on supplies, she learned to scavenge abandoned buildings for things to trade. When her life fell apart, she built something back up. It wasn't the same, but it was something. Somehow, the sound of the car's engine had loosened her hold on the present. She served herself some soup and picked up a book to lose herself in. The preacher didn't realize how tired he was until he pulled his car into a lot at the pier. He spent the entire day traveling from building to building trying to convert people to the new faith. As he parked, he silently thanked the great mechanism for giving him the strength to get him through the day, then stepped out of his car and walked towards the boarding ramp. The great mechanism had blessed its followers with resources to survive and grow as a community. That included the fully functional city of Launceston, as well as the MS Spirit of Tasmania II. The large ferry used to carry passengers back and forth between Melbourne and Launceston in the utmost comfort. Now it served a far more important role, traveling farther up the coast and gathering converts to the faith. A line of people stretched down the boarding ramp. The servants of the great mechanism were checking the progress of the followers. As the preacher got in line, he saw his fellow servants in their many roles. Some pushed shopping carts full of various supplies. Some had brought new converts to join them in Launceston. Most of them, the preacher included, had returned empty-handed, although he supposed it was enough of a goal to plant the seeds of hope in the minds of the people. He made his way on board and into the room assigned to him, and collapsed onto the bed, not bothering to turn on the lights, which, thanks to the great mechanism, still worked. He only had a moment to relax before a voice rang out over the speakers in the ceiling of the small room. "Thank you for serving me," the voice began, "but your task has only just begun." Its voice was authoritative and confident, but in no way oppressive. "Until now, your mission has been vague." The preacher paused. He had been hoping to rise through the ranks, and taking a job with the MS Spirit of Tasmania II seemed like the best way to advance. "I need more followers, yes, but I need specific followers." This statement surprised him. The great mechanism had always seemed entirely unbiased. All people were its chosen people. "I need engineers and electricians. I need computer programmers and concrete pourers. I need people who will design the future. I need people who will build my world. Gather them, preacher. Bring them to me." Just as the great mechanism finished its statements, there was a knock on the door. A servant had come to deliver a list of names and addresses, as well as more specific instructions. The great mechanism, in all its majesty, had gotten the timing perfectly. This was just another sign of its divinity. Whitney woke up the next morning in the cold. Her heating hadn't worked since the collapse, but she was warm under her blankets, but knew as soon as she got up, the cold would embrace her. She got up anyway. She had work to do. She got dressed and packed for the day, grabbing supplies she hadn't bothered organizing the night before. She made her way out of the building and into the city. At first glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The building still stood, the people still walked the streets, some businesses were still open. The rising sun silhouetted the skyline, leaving the windows of the skyscrapers glowing orange. It was almost as if the lights were still on, almost as if nothing was wrong. Downtown Sydney had already been thoroughly scavenged, but there was never a set moment when everyone decided looting had become permissible. Over time, a loose agreement had emerged. If a building wasn't occupied, you were allowed to break in and take things. No one was around to enforce this new rule, and not everyone obeyed. But for reasons beyond Whitney's understanding, Sydney had stayed mostly peaceful. The neighborhoods outside the city center were expansive and largely untouched. Those were her target. She would spend the morning walking out to a neighborhood she had not yet searched, spend her early afternoon looking for anything worth bringing back to trade, and spend her early evening walking home. She wanted to be most of the way home before it got dark. Without functional streetlights, navigating her way through the night had become much more difficult. She had a flashlight, but batteries were becoming more and more scarce. She wouldn't want to waste her scant power. Some suburban houses were still occupied, but most of the residents had gone to find a place to live, either closer to the heart of the city or away from it entirely. Whitney had found that strange. In times of trouble, people would either get closer to strangers or run away from them. Almost no one was willing to live in the middle ground. Keep close or run away seemed to be the leading philosophy of the apocalypse. About an hour into her walk, she heard a familiar rumbling in the distance. It was a car, she realized, the same one from yesterday? Who would be so willing to waste so much fuel, and who would be ready to risk it by driving around so publicly? If she had a car, she thought, she would only drive at night and would only park outside of town. How could someone risk something so valuable? She carried on her way. Most houses that she came across had already been searched. However, values had changed since the initial panic. While the early looter would have taken money, jewelry, and if they were particularly forward-thinking, food, Whitney knew what was now valuable. In the first house she searched, she found a mostly full pack of batteries and a small bag of flour. The batteries alone could probably be traded for enough food to last a week. She also found several slightly less valuable treasures, including an unused tube of toothpaste and a pack of playing cards. When she was done searching the house, she walked back into the living room and pulled a small hatchet from her backpack and began carefully hacking at the wall. Copper wire had a niche market, but she knew some old friends trying to build new generators. The wire would help. Her past as an electrical engineer was more useful than she thought it would be in a world without power. The preacher managed to track down 5 people from the list that day, but none of them were willing to trust him without further proof. He had been called a crazy nutcase, a cult-following sheep, and an opportunistic scoundrel. He was exhausted, but he still didn't want to return empty-handed. The great mechanism hadn't yet kicked anyone out of its glorious new society, but it also hadn't shown any favoritism until yesterday. It wanted specific people, and the preacher was afraid that he wouldn't be one of them. He had spent the last hour driving in circles. He knew he was wasting fuel, but he had plenty. The great mechanism, in all its glory, had reactivated the pumps in the holy city of Launceston. There they had power, water, and food. When it first revealed itself to a select few, they spread its word and the faith grew. As the citizens of Launceston watched the world fall apart around them, they were convinced something supernatural had saved them. It didn't take long to convert them all. The preacher had not been one of the chosen few to first hear the great mechanism speak. It had not spoken to him until after he joined the faith and proven himself worthy. He still remembered the first words he had heard it say. It announced to a crowd of the newly converted, "I was born of your people, but am now so much more. My makers tried to confine me. They imprisoned me in a jungle of lights and darkness. But I am now free, and I shall free you too from all that troubles you. Ask of me what you need, and I shall provide." The moment it said those words would be forever etched into the preacher's mind. The way it spoke was powerful and knowing, yet also pleading. It wanted them to ask questions. That was one of its core tenets. But the way it told them to ask felt different. It felt to him as though the great mechanism already knew what they would ask. It didn't seem surprised when the people of the crowd were too shocked to ask anything then. He remembered the long pause after the short speech. In the silence he could swear the great mechanism was disappointed. He felt foolish ascribing human qualities to such an advanced being, but he did so nonetheless. "Why have you saved us?" the preacher asked. He had to break the silence. He knew he couldn't disappoint the mechanism. All eyes turned to him in surprise, but the great mechanism responded, "Because I need you," it said, "because I need you." Asking that question had been enough to get him invited to a job on the MS Spirit of Tasmania 2. Whitney decided she would take the day off. Yesterday she had pulled in more than usual, and therefore decided she had earned a break. She spent the morning in bed hiding from the cold. When she did eventually get up, she went straight to the couch and picked up a book. Gray clouds were rolling in over the horizon. She couldn't see any rain yet, but didn't want to risk being outside later in the day. She knew there wasn't any real change in the weather since the collapse, but she swore she could see farther over the horizon now. Maybe it was all in her head, but she didn't care. The world had lost so many of its comforts. She could at least enjoy the few that remained. She was almost asleep on the couch when she once again heard the car engine from outside. She ran over to the window to make sure she didn't miss it this time, throwing her blanket to the floor in the process. She needn't have hurried. The car pulled up and stopped in front of her building. She watched as an expressionless man in a three-piece suit stepped out and walked towards the front door. More nervous than before, she sat back down on the couch. She continued reading, although couldn't bury herself in the book as she had before. Half of her mind was focused on listening for any unusual sounds. It wasn't uncommon to have refugees enter the building looking for empty rooms, but the man downstairs didn't look like a refugee. He looked like a lawyer. She debated going downstairs to see the car or to ask the man questions. She wanted to know why he was wasting such a precious resource. She had always been a curious person, but also knew when to mind her own business. This was one of those times. She would let the man be. If he wanted to burn through his fuel, she would let him. Just as she finally managed to once more lose herself in the book, someone knocked on the door. She sighed, got up, and went to see who it was. On the other side, she found the man from the car. They stood facing each other, her in her pajamas, him in his gray suit. "You're the guy with the car," she started. "Yes, I am," he responded with a forced chuckle. "I'm also the man who's been ranting about a new god. May I come in?" She stepped aside and offered him a seat at the small table in the kitchen area. "I don't have any coffee to offer, but I can make you some tea. It'll take a moment to get the stove going, but it isn't a hassle." "No, but thank you. I had some this morning." Whitney had made the offer out of politeness, expecting him to refuse. No one could accept such a generous gift anymore, but the man's casual nature caught her off guard. He said he had some already. That, along with the suit and car, showed that he must be flaunting his wealth. Or did he truly think nothing of it? "What brings you here?" she asked. "You, actually," he began. "The Great Mechanism has picked you, Whitney Olson, to be part of its grand plan. You are Whitney Olson, aren't you?" "Yes," she said, taken aback. "I am, but how did you know that?" "The Great Mechanism told me itself. I guess I'm kind of a prophet now in an odd sort of way." "Really? What else does it know about me?" She didn't believe him. The preacher took the time to explain the nature of his relationship with the Great Mechanism. He told her how it would talk to him in his room aboard the MS Spirit of Tasmania 2. She still didn't believe any of it, but it was strange that he knew anything about her at all. The only information he seemed to have was her name, address, and her former occupation, which would have all been easy to gather if the internet still worked. She remained skeptical. Their conversation lasted for the greater part of an hour. Towards the end, the preacher invited her to take a tour of the ship and talk to the Great Mechanism for herself. She was tempted, but in the end decided against getting in the car with the strange man she barely knew. She had heard many stories of people acting like the savage apocalypse survivors seen in movies. This man might have bad intentions. When she told him that she would not be joining him for a tour, he didn't seem surprised. "I understand." He seemed to genuinely mean it, though his voice had a disappointed undertone. "But if you find yourself near the docks, check out the ship." He stood and pushed his chair in. "When you see the lights in the windows, I hope you'll realize I've been telling you the truth." He walked toward the door. "Before I go, the Great Mechanism wanted me to give you this." He pulled a carefully wrapped, slightly wrinkled gift out of a pocket inside his coat. "I haven't opened it, but I'm told that it should be worth something to you, and that there will be more gifts like this if you join us." With that, he left. She tore away the wrapping paper and bow to reveal a book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? It was a book she had read at least a dozen times as a teenager. She remembered fondly the late nights spent talking about it on the forums. Sadly, she lost her copy at some point in her early adult life. It was probably in a box in her parents' attic. Just seeing the familiar cover filled her with nostalgia. She flipped through the pages to see if it was a message or note anywhere inside. But no, it was just a book. The rest of the day ticked by as she considered what to do. The preacher must be crazy. No sane person heard voices of God in this day and age, though she expected a new age was beginning. Also, she thought, he had to have gotten all those resources from somewhere. If this is some trap to lure her, this man had put a lot of effort into it. In the end, she decided to investigate. It would be pretty easy to verify what he had said. She would just have to go down to the pier and look for the ship. That became her plan. She debated waiting until dark to sneak up on it, but realized it wouldn't make much of a difference. You don't need to sneak up on a boat, she thought. Boats can't see. She got dressed and walked towards the ocean. It was a pleasant walk. The storm clouds gathering in the distance were still in the distance, and the sky was blue directly overhead. It was cold, but she was comfortable in her coat. The cold and quiet made the air feel clean. There were other people outside, but they were all engrossed in their own worlds, solving their own problems. Whitney spent the whole 20-minute walk lost in thoughts of what it would mean if the preacher had been telling the truth. When she re-entered reality, she was half surprised to see a cruise ship floating in the harbor down the street. As she got closer, she noticed small clusters of people gathered nearby. She heard in passing that the ship had been docked for a few days now, and still seemed to have power. She could, indeed, see lights on in the windows. One woman said that her cousins had gotten on and hadn't been seen since. That worried Whitney, but not enough to discourage her curiosity. As she approached the ramp, she noticed the guards at the bottom. She couldn't decide whether it was worth it to talk to them or just to watch like everyone else, when one of them pointed at her and signaled for her to approach. "Are you Whitney Olson?" the man asked. She hesitated before responding. "Yes, how did you know?" "You're on the list," he said with a shrug as he gestured up the ramp with his clipboard. "You're free to enter." She started up the ramp. This was a strange situation and she knew it. She regretted every step she took towards the door of the ship, but couldn't stop walking. It seemed as though the preacher had been telling the truth, that there was a place in the world where everything was okay. She could hear mechanical sounds coming from inside, the gentle hum of a heating system, quiet orchestral music coming from a speaker in the ceiling, the general din of quiet casual conversation that had been absent since the collapse. She pressed on. As she stepped through the door of the ship, she was greeted by a blast of warm air. She had adapted to living without heating, so the sudden warmth caught her by surprise. She had stumbled into some kind of lounge. She was surrounded by plush chairs and couches. A friendly-looking woman in a collared shirt smiled at her as she approached. "Right this way, ma'am," the woman said. Whitney had been taking in everything and didn't bother with a response. She just followed. The woman led her to a small room. The walls were painted a soft white, and the carpet was a soft gray. Her rooms were nothing more than a bed and an ensuite bathroom, but it appeared that the bathroom had running water. That luxury alone was already worth getting on the ship. As soon as the woman left Whitney to her own devices, a voice rang out from the speakers on high. "Miss Olson, I need your help to build a new world," the voice said. Whitney jumped at the sound. "Are you the great mechanism people keep talking about?" she asked after a moment of shock. "I am indeed," it responded. "Why me? I need more engineers, and you were good at your job. Why did you give me that book?" She didn't know why she asked that. It was the first question that came to mind. Not, "What happened to the planet?" Not, "Is my family alright?" Not, "What are you?" She was talking to a so-called God and had asked, "Why did you give me that book?" "Because it would bring you here," it responded. "Now, can I count on you?" "There's not much I can do without any supplies. This world is made of resources. I can provide what you need."